Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Daylight Savings Time, Bud Marr.
Oh, my goodness. Why did you... Well, look, folks.
You're one of those, eh?
I like falling back. I think we should fall back every weekend and just see what that... No, I'm kidding. I just know there's people who every year they're late to church, this week because of jumping ahead. So, it'll be fine, but I wouldn't call myself spring forward, Bo.
Longer evenings, right? Or more daylight at the end of the day?
At this point, I'm confused.
Yeah.
I just know that everybody is going to complain about it. And but it's Lent, Bud. That's part of it, right? I'll say this. One more, we've talked about this before where the society accidentally mimics the church.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense that, as Christmas is getting ready to roll around, we add an hour, we fall back, we get to sleep in a little more. And of course, here in the middle of Lent, we're like, well, time to spring forward, time to give up an hour, right?
You know what's crazy? I have a colleague at work who's Orthodox, and this year, Western and Eastern Christians, I think we have the largest gap between Easter celebrations that you can have, because ours
early.
It's very early, April 1st.
No, March.
March 31st.
Yeah,
and theirs is, I think he said May. Is that possible?
Yeah,
I know it was after our semester ends, and the semester ends April 27th.
Because what you can do, right? Because it's about which full moon. So if you come in like right before or right after, you can sort of miss each other's full moon, and then you'd be off by a whole month or so.
That's crazy though, because some Christians, Western, will have March Easter and then May Easter.
Yeah. And so this is the Uncommon Good.
Sorry about that.
We got off on like calendars and things like that. But if you have been coming here regularly, you expect that from good old Bo Bonner here with you, Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and Director for the Center for Human Flourishing, Mercy College of Health Sciences. And then our good friend Bud, Mr. Calendar.
Well, there's a lot going on. I guess I have calendars on my mind because spring break starts this week. So Dr. Bud Marr, I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the college, so I work with our professors, making sure we provide great classroom instruction for our students.
So that they can have like the math skills to calculate how far they have to like set their alarms and everything like that. You know what, Bud? I want to say this, though, to our children who, I don't know if they're listening or not, but maybe they will someday. It used to be like very hard to remember to do this. Now, if you go to sleep, most of your stuff updates for you, and it's just like your oven is wrong or something like that.
No, that's right. We're very spoiled. You can wake up in the middle of the night this weekend and figure out what time it is, whereas like you're saying, I remember just how intense I felt about making sure my alarm clock was right the next day.
That would be a funny survey of all of our friends before it updated on its own. What time did you actually remember to spring the clock forward?
Yeah.
I was a night owl, so it was always probably around the same. You know what? Isn't it clocks like switch at 2 a.m.? Mm-hmm. So knowing me, it was probably 2 a.m. I can see you either being late in the night at 2 a.m. or you did it like at 5 on Saturday.
Yeah, I didn't want to feel like I was losing out on life, so I didn't like to switch it the night before. But time is weird. When Rachel and I were in Florida this little while back, we were still in Central Time Zone. I didn't know it was possible to be in Florida and still be in the Central Time Zone. It just seems Eastern to me.
Someday when we go on a radio tour and we do the show from different places, we should do the furthest the furthest East Central Time Zone city and the furthest West East Coast one. And I think the furthest West East Coast one is somewhere in Indiana.
That sounds right.
We were in the Panhandle, though,
yep.
Right? Okay.
Yep.
Look, we have already taken up the intro with very interesting things. This show is going to be particularly interesting. We're going to talk about Italy. We're going to talk about concerning trends and tarot cards. Tarot cards? Tarot. I don't remember. That shows you that I don't practice it.
Yeah.
You'll want to stick around for this. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. If we didn't make a big enough deal out of it in the intro, just to clarify, of course, that we are brought to you by Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu. We were covering a lot of territory about calendars and time, so it's time for you to go check out Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu. Bud brought up that it is spring break, so middle of the spring semester, a good time for you to go check it out and think about summer, next fall, etc. Thank you once more, Mercy College, for underwriting the show. Bud, today, I don't want to throw all this onus on you.
Yeah.
You sparked the idea, but we together, of course, have decided that we're going to jump into, I don't know, this is slightly odd for us maybe, but to talk about a trend that the news is identifying, hopefully to get into deeper waters like we always do. So I'll let you kick it off.
Well, credit where credit is due. So this is an article that I found in the Catholic Herald online, and the title is Italian Catholics Reverting to Ancient Roman Gods, Seers, and Sorcerers. And some of the information here just was kind of surprising or startling to me. So it talks about a number of lapsed Catholics in Italy are reverting to the deities of ancient Rome and turning to pagan seers, astrologers, and psychics, attesting to a potentially catastrophic collapse of Catholicism in its traditional bastion. And then some of the numbers. So it says there's over 160,000 sorcerers doing business in the occult New Age practices, with over 3 million Italians consulting the so-called Magi every year for advice. So this is an 8 billion euro industry. Between 10 to 13 million Italians, almost all of them baptized, have turned to sorcerers or witches at least once in their lives, while 30,000 Italians from all classes of society seek out psychics and visionaries on a weekly basis. So I guess I was just struck in a part of the world and a region that's a stronghold historically of Catholicism. As the article says, all of these Italians who were part of the survey, or the majority were baptized, but turning to these occult practices, tarot reading, psychics, other sort of New Age rituals, it's kind of surprising.
I mean, for me, I think we can solve this entire show with one word, and that's soccer. If your country likes soccer, no, I'm kidding. Yeah. We're just going to make everyone mad out of the gate. No, I'm joking. All those people who love soccer out there, I'm not saying soccer causes you to worship the devil.
John Wynn from the diocese just furiously turned off his radio.
We've made John Wynn mad. We've made John Leonetti mad. Who else can we throw in here? No, I think what's interesting in multiple ways. One hand, I'm going to mess this up, but I know that this is the case. Remember, do you know the name of the person who, I think he's a blessed, I don't think he's a saint, or maybe his cause is started, but he started out as a Satanist, and then he became, I think, a priest.
Not off the top of my head.
Right. So the reason I'm bringing this up, I'm almost dead sure he's Italian too. And one of the things I think is important, this is where, on one hand, it is concerning. So what I'm about to say is not using history to dismiss this. I'm saying historically it's happened before, and historically the church has responded. I think sometimes, Bud, people forget how lost, in many ways, the religious culture of Europe. I mean, people will do this with France. They're like, of course, France had the revolution. Italy was a rather non-religious place, even though it had the Vatican, precisely in sort of the time period you were studying. I know you were studying Newman, so that means it was more like England. But wouldn't you say, even just from your historical knowledge of theology, I think people sometimes forget the 19th century in Italy. First of all, that was the first century that Italy, quote unquote, as a nation existed, right? Yeah. So it's before that, you would be talking about different regions in Italy. But the sort of Masonic, not even infiltration, just Masonry was very popular in certain parts of what would become Italy. The occult, the sort of anti-clericalism. I mean, people forget Pius IX had an assassination attempt on him that someone literally killed a cardinal that was walking beside him. So before we get into right now, we should point out this is not completely unprecedented. And in some ways, it's precisely the more Catholic countries that have seen some of this more anti-clericalism and even occultism and Masonry even maybe more than the Protestant countries historically. Am I talking out of pocket, dear historical theologian?
I kind of get your point. You know, there is a way when we think about the past that we tend to look at it through rose-colored glasses or put a sort of like glossy shine on it. I think even in the United States, you know, you watch a movie like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And sort of like 19th century America sounds very idyllic, and we kind of like, things were simpler then, something like that. But even in our own context, like religious practice has ebbed and waned. I mean, one reason why the Great Awakenings stand out is because there was a need for a Great Awakening.
And there was more than one of them.
Yeah.
Yep.
I recently watched, I hope I don't get too far afield here, but like Ken Burns' documentary on Prohibition. And like during the Civil War era, the sheer amount of alcohol that most like American men averaged in terms of consumption. So, in raising these issues, I don't mean to frame it as sort of like, well, things were simpler or more straightforward, however many years ago, like whatever sort of historical reference point you want to identify, and now like society's going off the deep end or something. But it is, I guess there's something sad about seeing this sort of trend in Italy. It's a good reminder for us. I think here in the States, like we grew up, our childhood is sort of like the 80s, and some cultic practices are sort of like, they're perceived as very innocent. You know, things like Ouija boards. Did you ever say Bloody Mary in front of a mirror or see someone talk about that?
Oh, yeah, I heard people talk about it.
Yeah.
We did not pull that off. It was already Beetlejuice by our point.
Okay.
Yeah, you know.
But there are ways where, you know, of course, like sacred scripture has some pretty firm, I guess saying pretty firm doesn't make sense. Some firm admonitions against, like, you know, don't dabble in the occult. Don't seek, like divinization would be trying to contact the dead, which is totally different than asking for the intercession of the saints. But all of these things can be ways where we drift away from God, or where even Satan gets a foothold in our life. So this article for me was kind of a good reminder of that.
So I figured out who it was, and I agree with you on this. The person we were talking about was Blessed Bartolo Longo.
Okay.
So he was an ordained satanic priest before coming back to the Catholic faith and becoming a Third Order Dominican. He was born in 1841, and he became a law student at the University of Naples in 1861, and that's where he started dabbling in the occult and spiritualism, Satanism, before coming back to the church. The only reason I bring that up is, like I said, to not abstain us and go like, no worries. What's weird, and I'm going to mess up the math. What's interesting, I think, from the history and what I've read, in sort of 200-year chunks, we sort of see this stuff happen over and over again. So, and it's different, you know, but now that we're a worldwide culture, but certainly this idea about, I mean, somewhere in the 1800s, the very Catholic nations of Europe were going through these problems. You'll hear other people talk about that the sort of 1600s after the 30 Years' War were entire generations that really had a lot of problems with the church and sort of the heaviness of all that was going on. 200 years before that, in the 1400s, what were people, this is early 1400s, but there was a lot of misgivings and disbelief and doubt because of the Black Plague, right? And like, so in exactly these things that exacerbated social conditions led to the Protestant Reformation. The 1200s, people start to talk about how the overaffluence of the church had people thinking this way or that. You get back to the thousands, right? St. Francis of Assisi is a reformer, right? It's not like everybody's St. Francis of Assisi. So anyway, the point that I'm getting at is it's not homogenous, right? It's not like, oh, there's always some good or bad, and you always have to deal with it. It's not a perfect cycle, but I certainly think it's the case, Bud, that it is precisely where the church has had the strongest foundation and foothold that you see this. I mean, ebbing and flowing is probably not violent enough of water image to really, I mean, it's high tide and low tide sort of stuff. Yeah. Now, the idea here, what I'm not trying to say is, well, it's like the magnetic force of the moon, so we can't do anything about it. But what is it, Bud, that, I mean, it's not, so Italy, France, Spain, Belgium, Quebec, all places that if you looked in circa 1922 were extremely Catholic. Ireland, of course. Yeah. So all of them have not sort of, you know, eventually whittling away. I mean, Americans have been talking about the whittling away of the sort of religious sense, but man, that's been happening like the entire 4 decades of my life. And every time anyone says this, you go like, okay, but yeah, and there's these examples of like places where in America where religion is popping back up. The places we've mentioned have all gone in recent memory, nosedives. So what is it, Bud, that the places that sometimes seem to show the greatest fervor or seem to be the most assuredly Catholic, what happens to those? And what I know you want to get to, and I think it's very important, is it's not just a matter of us like dropping the ball and say, oh man, that's too bad the church dropped the ball. What happens when people drop the ball? And this gets to, I think, your Chesterton quote that you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, when I was looking at that article, one quote that came to mind was by the great English writer G.K. Chesterton. And he said at one point, when man ceases to worship God, it's not that he worships nothing, but worships everything. And Bo, I feel like one thing that's kind of distinctive of our day and age, and maybe this maps on somewhat to like the Reformation period, is I feel like a lot of us sense or feel like we're living through an epochal change. And so there's been a certain kind of stability to post-World War II Europe and the United States, but we feel like we're on the brink of something very different. It has something to do with the acceleration of technology. I think it's also related to increasing secularism. But whatever factors you want to point to, we feel like the world for our children is likely to look very different than it does for us today. And that makes me think about all these trends because, as Chesterton points out, others have said, man, like Homo sapien, what makes us distinct? Is it, our language, our laughter, our culture? And, there have been theologians who have said, like, well, what's distinct about human beings is that we're a worshiping animal. And so what Chesterton is pointing out is that sometimes when especially like I think prominent thinkers give up the practice of faith or religion, they tend to think of themselves as like, well, humanity, my community, our collective society is entering into this new stage of reason. We're leaving behind superstition and tradition. We'll no longer be burdened with those things. And so we'll approach the world with like clear vision and get down to brass tacks and really tackle our problems, not by relying on some sort of like crutches of divine revelation or the wisdom that our forefathers passed on to us, but really just approaching them purely with rationality. I think what you see with these trends in Italy, I think what you see in our own country is that it's not generally how it works out because man is a worshiping animal. That kind of instinct to know and love God, if we turn away from that, those energies are usually directed elsewhere. So that, I don't have the stats right in front of me, but Americans in their own way lean on certain sort of like ideas that historically would have been perceived as superstitious. And so, once that vacuum is created, it's usually filled with some sort of religious practice. It's just not historic Christianity or one of the other great faith traditions. And in some cases, I think, sociologists are pointing out some of these energies become more dangerous when they're divorced from religion, kind of like the high stakes that people perceive with electoral politics now, like how much is seen at stake. Because if that's like the highest order of our existence, then if the persons who I support, like if they lose, my entire future might be in jeopardy.
Yeah, this is all very interesting because I think you can look at it in various ways, especially compared to some of the hobby horses we like to come back to in many ways. On one hand, it's interesting to think so we talk about idols that don't seem like idols. And so there's superstitions, of course, that don't seem like superstitions. Well, what is a superstition? In sort of popular, just using the word, it's usually something to the effect of like sub-organized religion, or atheists will say all religion is superstitious. And so this idea of super, the office line, I'm not superstitious, I'm just a little stitious, right? So what's the stitious part? Whatever it might mean etymologically, we get at this idea that there's something about the spiritual life that is manipulative and mechanical. Yeah. I think that that's what most people are getting at. And so if you look at what a lot of these things are that they're talking about, Ouija boards, tarot cards, I mean, voodoo dolls, whatever it is, it's not even like old Christian descriptions of pagan religion, where it's like, well, superstition is something about false gods, right? Like that's like super meaning like it's over and above what could be reasonably believed. That, like we said, comes down and like you got the new atheists calling all people who worship any sort of deity superstitious. Mostly what it seems like in that article, and I think what we're getting at is there seems to be let's worship or let's truncate the spiritual life into something that helps me get a grasp of life. Like there's a lot of zodiac stuff as well. Although you go back in Christian history, the Christians don't seem to have as big of a problem with the zodiac as. Any rate, it's complicated to my point. The point that also has to do with their science, though. Like, so if you have a Ptolemaic universe, zodiacism doesn't seem as weird. But anyway, maybe a topic for another day. What I want to get at is, well, we have all sorts of superstitions that are grounded in sort of like hopeful beliefs, but don't actually have a lot of actual purchase in real life that are really about manipulating people. And it's stuff like, I'll just be mean, free markets or like the invisible hand of the market. Things that we got from the Enlightenment rationalists that I think anybody worth their salt who really bears down on it and says, it's not like scientific like you think it is. And so I don't even mean you have to get into the economical theory. I'm just throwing out that people have said, if you think about what people were telling everyone in 2019, Bud, about how they should act in terms of the economy, finance, all of these things like this, a lot of their beliefs turned out to be superstition, at least compared to like what happened when the COVID pandemic happened. Or you think about what people talk about, how you should invest or what people should do, and they will have firm belief and they will spread it sort of. So I'm calling economists tarot card readers, and that's... In fact, I don't actually mind saying that, but I understand that some people will think that I'm blowing this out of the water. But I just want to point out, Bud, that to your point, we've actually been setting up people to like this stuff.
Yeah.
So what I think people are, before we get into the problem as Christians, as a church and theology, if this seems weird to just cultured society, we've been asking people to have sort of superstitious relationships to how they interact with the world, because we've taught them to be utilitarians, that everything is instrumental and everything's about advantage and how you manipulate the universe to get what you want. So because we've had such a long time with that, spirituality flattening out, people want there to be spirituality. But when they think about spirituality, they're like, well, how do I have a manipulative one that I can manipulate things instead of, and this is where we're at fault, be manipulated by religion.
Yeah.
And I think that's where at least one facet of this very interesting topic can go.
This actually coalesces in interesting ways with the episode from last week where we were talking about the difference between a search for certitude in the strict sense and trust in God. And what does it mean to trust God as distinct from seeking a kind of certitude about things that we can't fully know? We didn't plan this with the show, but now you really got my wheels turning on a number of different points. Like with this question of superstition versus sacramentality, sometimes, especially like non-Catholic Christians say like, well, there's elements of the Catholic faith that are very superstitious. And in the second segment, maybe we could get into like, how do you have a proper understanding of even God's activity in the church? So, this is pretty basic history. I mean, a lot of folks know this tidbit, but like when we talk about hocus pocus, which is often like a shorthand for superstition, that kind of flowed out of criticisms of the Mass in Latin, hoc est inum corpus meum. Yep. And so it sounded like people were just hearing this like mumbling from the priest or something. And that's where Catholics were accused of superstition. My Protestant relatives, of course, have had a hard time wrapping their minds around something like the brown scapular. When they see my kids wear a scapular. And of course, with the scapular, it's not supposed to operate as some sort of like talisman, but it's kind of just a recognition of like these promises that God has made. And because we believe God is faithful and true, like wearing this is like honoring or keeping in mind those promises made by God. But there is kind of a fine line. And, I think I was throwing out ideas about the temple last week. We do always want to keep a proper understanding where, yes, God has promised that when we say these words and when we gather in this way that he'll be present, but also that we can't constrain God, or we don't have sort of like a control on how he operates in our midst. So it's sort of like this proper, like holy fear when it comes to, even when God is present in the Blessed Sacrament,
Yes.
you know, I need to approach that experience in a certain manner.
And so, right. So real quick before we go, like this gets to the Pez dispenser view of the Eucharist, right? Where we confect God on our terms and then we consume him because we wanted to. But it also gets to this idea of prosperity gospel sort of stuff, right? Yeah. Where like we have prayers and they're secret prayers, and if you do them, then you will beat your enemy and get the Pokemon that you want out of the world. All very interesting stuff. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, we've been talking about what was spurred on by an article in Catholic Herald that was about an increase in occult activity, superstition, in what was presumed, of course, very Catholic Italy. This was from a survey. A lot of these people have been baptized. So to find out what's going on, we have John Leonetti. No, we're not interviewing John Leonetti. I'm joking. We've been talking about how this observation has much more interesting facets, I think, than just, oh, this is the church dropping the ball. What is it that this is an indication of that points to deeper realities in the world and the church? We've talked about maybe sort of the context historically. This isn't the first rodeo with this sort of stuff. However, that maybe there's something unique about the modern world that makes this more likely. So I think we ended segment 1 getting into this idea, okay, well, that seems to be, for some people in the modern world, the church, the pot calling the kettle black. The superstitious church is going to be mad because some of their former adherents, they just like tarot cards better than prayer cards. They like, Jupiter more than God the Father. Yeah. What's the big deal? Aren't they just making a choice? What I want to get at, and before I throw it to you, is I think precisely that sort of question and misunderstanding why it is that the church thinks these are distinct is a clue why this is happening more often than we realize.
Yeah, and I think you've used the phrase a couple of times, like the church dropping the ball. I think this can be an opportunity for introspection and self-evaluation on our parts. What I have in mind there is, so you were talking in the first segment about how there are elements of modern society that we think of as very rational or reason-driven, like economics, which really in some ways oftentimes operate with assumptions that will never bear out. Like, oh, the economy will grow perpetually. Like there will be no end to the sort of like profit margins that we're able to produce or whatnot. So I think because of that, I've got a few different layers in view. Because of that, a lot of individuals in our culture, they feel like things are spinning out of control. They see the people in charge or who are supposed to be in charge operating with these like misguided assumptions. And then when things go off the tracks, whether that's like an ill-advised war or, the inability of our authorities to prevent certain things, like I'm thinking about 9/11 or even like the way natural disasters are handled, they start looking for answers. And ironically, or maybe paradoxically, at the same time that I think there's been a diminished sense of trust in our government and things, the church in the United States, and this is painting with very broad strokes, has maybe with good intention kind of like tried to make the faith more reasonable or palpable. So we talked a few weeks ago about Lenten practices and this kind of like, again, well-intentioned sort of like, well, we're not going to just have things be rote and wooden, but we'll get to the real meaning of things. And I do think it's fair to say that in some liturgical practices or popular devotions, there's been like, maybe we were laying it on kind of thick there. And so it's more about the homily is going to be relevant and the prayers are going to be more level-headed.
Yeah, by the world's terms, yeah.
But that's led to another place where, again, as people are looking for something to ground themselves in, it's just funny to me because at the time that the church at an institutional level was sort of like abandoning the use of incense and chant, and not that those things were prevalent everywhere, but those are a historic part of Catholic worship. You saw things like Taizé crop up where it's like, Well, young people on college campuses are looking for this kind of practice that sort of resembles more traditional worship. And then, as we were talking about in secular society, you see things like tarot cards, or I'm going to like have a meditative space during my day where I burn a candle or burn incense.
Sage.
Why
that one? I don't know. At any rate, yes.
Yeah. And so you see people looking for those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And I love how you pointed this out about this distrust. I would take it with institutions, generally speaking. I'll take it a step further. Disasters will happen. Wars will happen. Catastrophes, man-made or otherwise, will happen. And it's not only that they don't seem to be knocking it out of the park in response, which supposedly the modern world was supposed to provide us with, but they will begin doing magical thinking sort of stuff, where they'll just declare, oh, well, if we do, of course, it looks like this, but, if we just really sort of put our nose to the grindstone and keep doing what we're doing, by the way, it's not working. But if we just keep doing it, things will improve. And so I find it strange when people go, authorities are engaging in magical thinking. Why would you not think regular people will start engaging in magical thinking? Yeah. And they're either going to be like, I'll manifest it on a board. If I just get the latest like Doge coin or whatever, it will never go down. Or get out tarot cards, right? I think what you're getting at, though, is where the church fails is not simply that it chose sort of the wrong comportment towards, how it markets itself. That's not what you're saying. What you're saying is it lost its nerve in precisely the time when if it would just show a backbone, it's precisely that backbone people are looking for. And for multiple reasons. On one hand, whatever you want to say about tarot cards, Ouija boards, and all those things, they are tangible, right? And people need tangible hope. And yes, they're magical because people want magic in their lives. I think this is where someone like Tolkien's point gets missed a lot. He will make the point that what is sort of magic in the bad way is always mechanical and technological. But magic in the good way, like how the elves do it or Gandalf or whatever like this, is something much more akin to what we've said with like education: wonder, awe, humility, gratitude, finding the warp and weft of nature, all these things like this. So the point, Bud, is when we won't do it, when we're the people that have the special sauce, when we have the salt that will season the world, as Jesus Christ himself said, and we lose our nerve to be the salt precisely when the world's asking for it, the world is going to go look for salt substitutes, many of them not nearly as good as stuff, many of them poisonous to the people who consume them. But that's our fault, precisely when the world was beckoning for that sort of difference. On the flip side, because I know that that sounds like, oh, well, then anything traditional is good. However, if you start to care about the salt only for the salt's sake, and that you yourself aren't willing to become salt for the world, then it just becomes one more, again, technological thing. You can be superstitious about the church's practices, but that's not a matter of like because they're like too old worldly or not. It's whether you deal with them like they're a manipulative tool that you can get what you want, or do you submit to them? Do you submit ourselves? Do you oblate yourself? Do you sacrifice yourself and put yourself at the altar of those practices? Not do I grab a hold of them and bludgeon the world over the head with them and make the world do what I want, which is superstitious, bad magic.
What's cool to me about today's episode is I feel like a few of the threads that we talked about in early 2024 are kind of coming together because
we're wizards.
That's right. You know what? There's Charles Taylor, one of the top 5 living philosophers, in his book, A Secular Age, right? He talks about the difference between our world today and the world 500 years ago. And I share this just because I want to show some humility on the show and say like how challenging it is to navigate these waters. But Taylor talks about in that book about the buffered self. And what he means by that is that as modern persons, we feel kind of like there's this buffer between myself as an individual and any sort of like spiritual reality. So the default position of a European living several centuries ago would be the assumption of faith. Now, they may not practice their faith that well, but it was sort of the water in which they swam. And, Sundays, most everyone in town went to mass. At the very least, that was sort of the focal point of their communities. And so it was kind of like the organizing structure of everything. Today, the default position is one of skepticism, so that even those of us who practice the faith, it's almost like an achievement. What I mean by achievement is it's something that we kind of self-consciously assent to. It's not so much the water that we swim in.
Right.
We see ourselves as distinct from most people that we interact with and work with, right? Because of that, I think it's harder for us to, each age has its own challenges, but for us, that kind of balance that we're talking about, that you strike between like, there's a spiritual realm. We know that each of us, for instance, like has a guardian angel who watches over us. We pray for the intercessions of the saints. So there's this cloud of witnesses that surrounds us.
Mine helped me get really good windshield wipers today, but I'll have to tell you next week. But keep going.
I'm eager to hear that story. I'm glad it was windshield wipers and not Chinese food.
That's right.
But so because of that, like here's the point. What I'm driving at is it's sort of a struggle on the way. And I know that even in my own life, I had a professor say to me once, like 90% of Christians living in our country today are practical atheists. Mm-hmm. And what he meant by that is the way we just go about life really is sort of framed by kind of, you could say, atheistic assumptions. Mm-hmm. And religious practice is sort of this veneer on top. It really is almost sort of the triumph of like hyper-capitalism. And I don't want to get into an economic argument today. I'm not advocating Marxism by saying that, but there's just this all-encompassing order where, as we think about the most important questions of life, it really is sort of like, well, how is this going to impact the market? You know, we sort of watch like job growth up and down, and the practice of the faith. What if you jump on cable news or something, like a secular person is calling religion, like that's fine as long as it's a privatized affair. And so it's an achievement. It's something that we're struggling towards or struggling to. And that's where I feel the church's pain. Like a few minutes ago, it sounded like I was maybe just being like hard on the institutional church, but it is a challenge to cultivate that. A few weeks ago, we talked about how culture is kind of a soil that belief can take roots in. And I don't know if a lot of our parishes operate in that manner. There's the parishes are full of people who have good intentions, who want to grow in the faith, know the faith, but it's like our day-to-day lives just don't have that rhythm that makes possible like really authentic evangelism.
You know, the thing that what you were pointing out just there really it brings me to two minds. Because, okay, so going back to Charles Taylor, another point he makes, Charles Taylor writes so much in his books, it's always, I don't ever know exactly what's his most important takeaway. Certainly from that book, what a lot of people talked about was disenchantment. And the idea is the immanent frame, right? The world was sort of, a ceiling was put on top of the world in the modern world. And what religion is left to do, so to speak, is poke holes in that roof so that the starlight can shine in. And when people get really on a roll, that's what they start to talk about. And certainly I think, man, that explains a lot. However, and I want to give shout out to Artur Rossman, who pointed out this book to me. So there's this book, Bud, that it talks about Descartes, but it talks about basically modernism. It's called The Myth of Disenchantment by Jason Storm. And one of the things that's really interesting is when you properly start getting what we're calling the modern take on science, a lot of those people who were really into science were really into esotericism.
Yeah, I've read that.
Right? So Descartes, all of those people thought you could talk to the dead. They were into spiritualism. So weirdly enough, this person makes a convincing case that the more you get into science, you actually see an uptick of precisely what we're talking about in Italy. So I don't know if I believe this or not, but a very radically different take on what we were talking about, that same article, is actually that Italy is not in front of the times, they're behind the times. So Italy's only finally now getting their full brunt of sort of 20th century esoteria, which is interesting because, I don't want to go clear off on this one. This is another one where I have multiple friends reading this stuff. Dude, the guy who helped develop the first rockets that were shot into space, one was a Nazi doctor that we saved from Nuremberg to bring over to the United States to help develop the rocket. The other, and I am blanking on his name. If I knew we were going to talk about this, I would have looked into it. He straight up was friends with the guy who started the Church of Satan in the United States and was big into all of this sort of occultism.
Like the Aleister Crowley crowd?
Yes.
Yeah.
The guy who basically we wouldn't have rockets that could launch from Earth's surface into space except for these sort of people. Yeah. Now, I'm not trying to say that rockets are demonic yet. It's a theory of mine. But what I'm saying is maybe we have this wrong, that it's and I think Charles Taylor, what I know of him, would be inclined to say this. Yeah. What we have is competing disenchantments and competing reenchantments. And the question is which ones win out. I think it's funny when people who talk about reenchantment, and Bud, you and I are in this world, we talk about education a lot, where, you know, great books, like all these things like this. I'm all for it, like re-enchanting the world. But why would you then be surprised that some kids got into tarot cards? Yeah. What I think is interesting is it doesn't seem to be like the dorks go read, you know, they're not coming from great books programs and then deciding that they believe in wood nymphs. Yeah. This seems to be people coming from atheism, or sort of like, I mean, because sure, the Italians that they're talking about are baptized Catholics, but we all know that there's a current dearth of belief in a lot of European countries. So I'm not, maybe it would take more sociological work, but I'm admitting that I can see it both ways, and I'm not dead sure which it is. Is this because of a lack of enchantment? Or is, weirdly enough, this is sort of how reenchantment, or not disenchantment, but different enchantment works when the sort of mechanistic, individualistic, economic, scientific world takes over, and Italy's only just finally really getting to it. I don't know, man. I don't know.
Well, it's kind of like on the show, whenever we bring up a challenge, we always try to like show the silver lining of the opportunity. And as we're talking about this, like you had mentioned, we were batting around Charles Taylor. I also thought of the great thinker, Rene Girard. Yeah. And Girard points out how secularism, which Christians tend to be very critical of, is really sort of like hyper Christianity. Mm. And what he means by that, so you think about something like the Salem witch trials, or the movement in European cultures to the movement away from sort of, you know, blaming the Jews for things like Jewish pogroms and things like that. He's saying sometimes when we talk about those realities, like I'll stick with the Salem witch trials, we think of that reality as like, well, that was very much driven by religion. But really, as people started to question those practices, it was kind of like the gospel mentality that got folks to be able to like criticize those things. So I'm going to distill a huge amount of work, like in a nutshell. It's not fair to it, but, you know, like in ancient culture, sometimes with scapegoating of victims, the victim was to blame. And then mythologies would kind of frame it as like, well, the person we killed, like they deserve to die. And then sacred scripture, divine revelation upends that, where God is on the side of the oppressed. God, like Abel's blood cries out from the ground. And then of course with Jesus Christ, he's both priest and victim. So he offers himself as an innocent victim. And Girard said this kind of tears away the mask of scapegoating and how illogical and contrary to God's will it truly is. And so in our day and age, like even things that, again, Christians are very critical of, and maybe for good reason, like wokeism, what we use, I know that's a big umbrella term, it really is sort of a strong attention to people who are perceived as victims, right? And so we might want to say, like, we're not going to fall into that trap, or not, like, of course, like buy that worldview hook, line, and sinker. But there's a lot of opportunity there. And really the dynamics that we see are not wholly negative. It's kind of like a conversation that needs to be had.
Oh, and I mean, but what we're trying to say is there is absolutely a Christian triumphalism that we're advocating. I know that's not cool to say, but it's not this, oh, here's the game plan for society that gets you certainty, like we were talking about last week. Mm-hmm. What it really is to say is, guys, nearly every problem we have in the modern world is just some Christian heresy. And that makes people real mad. They're like, how dare you think it all revolves around you? And I'm like, hey, you tell me what rampant secularism is, except what Girard was saying, right? It's a Christian impulse that has been let out of the barn and has gone feral. Same thing with what we're talking about here. I think it's a Christian impulse to want sacramentality. and we're not offering it. And so they're going to go find it where they know to find stuff. We're all capitalists now. They find it on marketplaces. They find it on Instagram. And then we get mad because they're trying to make this spiritual yearning tangible. And they're going to do it in a way that seems like it makes some sense. And they have lived in the market their entire life. So they're going to say, spiritual life must be a manipulable instrument. I go buy a service. I go do a thing. I can read my future. I can do this. I can do that. It's not surprising. It's just Christian heresy. The church can't lose its nerve, right? It has to own where this comes from, not just because I'm trying to say the church should flay itself and always be like, woe is us for being so bad and naughty. What I'm trying to say is you aren't going to get to the cure if you don't know where the poison came from. But that, like, again, you're the church historical theology. Isn't that sort of Newman's point, is that the history of the church is always trying to figure out how, when people dumb down the church too much and lead it into heresy, that the fullness of what the church has always been and will become is what makes it right the ship again.
Well, and I know we're up against the break, but the one thing that I would throw out there at the end, and maybe this is another episode, is the other pitfall that we have to avoid is thinking, oh, like the kids are turning into tarot cards, so we'll gamify the faith.
Yep, exactly.
And our app will compete with their superstition.
I like that. Yes, we'll throw in that. Yes, we're being very unpopular here at the end, but amen, brother. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, what I was thinking of is, are we to blame, you and I, are we superstitious about sports? And does that fit in with what we were talking about? That's too much to really bring up, but I'm like, my kids do sort of like pay attention to what shirts they've worn. Maybe I'm the problem.
Well, you threw out the Michael Scott line earlier about I'm not superstitious, I'm a little stitious. I think with sports I'm very stitious. But cold hard reality has cured some of that superstition. So I remember in college, like changing t-shirts mid-game, or like putting a Tom Osborne statue on a shelf and then removing it. But after so many like practices just did not pan out for me. I think it's all chance at this point.
And you know what? I'll say this because we have to get to the end. I actually think the pageantry of sports is a good complementary way to teach kids about like things being important. It's our community, blah, blah. But like you said, manipulating it, right? That is part of it. And then also, if you guys think this is just big theoretical stuff, Bud and I are pointing out, maybe some of you are a bit superstitious about gambling. Any rate.
Well, if you need a break from gambling and would like to join the prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio, we do pray the rosary on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. each day. The Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon. You can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
Yeah, and I wanted to say thank you to everybody. However you listen to the show, that's the airwaves that we're growing every chance that we get. Whether that's on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or our good podcast listeners, we very much appreciate it. I know we're running long, so I'll just say if you want to check out the events that are going on in and around the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com, see all the things that we have started to get lined up for spring and some even into summer. One of the things that I wanted to tell all of you, of course, is we're getting ready to have our spring, we don't call it Carathon anymore.
Do we say fundraiser?
Spring fundraiser. And you'll probably actually be hearing more of Bud and I when that week rolls around. Either you're welcome or sorry, depending on how you feel about that. But I just want to really emphasize the pitch that I always try to make sure we talk about. This ministry is not just the voices you hear on air, whether it's the local ones or the national feed. It's not only the people behind the boards or behind the offices. All wonderful people. I work with them all the time. But it's your ministry as well. And you make that possible through your prayers, in which we ardently ask you to keep praying for us, the wonderful volunteers that make so much happen. But of course, the material reality is what makes this ministry able to work, to be on 24/7, to go through walls, whether they be home or prison or school or where it is. We're always with the radio there when people need us. You make that possible. Thank you for giving. please consider to do that. You can do that at 515-223-1150 or the Iowa Catholic Radio app or iowacatholicradio.com, but especially coming up here in the Springs fundraiser soon. Bud, wonderful show. As always, I have a lot to think about now.
Yep, make sure you wake up on time this week, but great show. Thanks, as always, for the opportunity, Bo.
This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.